Thank you, Dr. Malvo, for being an excellent moderator, as always. And thank you to the panelists for all of your great information. We really appreciate you making this accessible and compelling. So as you can see, we've been talking about solutions. I've been following the Twitter chat, and somebody said, solutions, we want solutions. Well, part of the solution is raising the revenue to make the investments we need, and the tax code is a huge part of that. So with that, we have a next solutions panel, which is about making equity work. Making equity work. And we have a dynamic panel. Can I have the panel come up to the front, please? It's going to be moderated by Lawrence Parks. He's a Senior Vice President of External and Legislative Affairs at the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco. In this role, he works with Congress, federal regulators, financial institutions, and housing and community development advocates to shape the environment in which the bank operates. So previously, he was a senior policy advisor to U.S. Commerce Secretary Ron Brown. He oversaw the Economic Development Administration and the Minority Business Development Agency, and he represented the Secretary in the National Economic and Domestic Policy Councils. So he has a long history of work in this area, and we are looking forward to a dynamic and innovative panel. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you. Thank you, Maya, and thank you for doing this conference, because I think it's so critical that we sort of begin to talk about the wealth component as well as the income component. So I applaud you for putting this together and making this happen. We got a couple of housekeeping matters I got to go through really quickly. One is that we're probably going to get interrupted by Congressman Cleaver, and so we all defer to where we are. So he will come up and probably interrupt our panel and sort of give a speech, because he's running late on votes. So we'll probably be interrupted at some point. The second thing is that when we get to the Q&A component, as you did in the previous panel, just line up at the mic and make sure you're asking a question and not just making a commentary, because we have a limited amount of time.
And the third is somebody's missing the keys, and this is the kind of cars they have.
Oh, okay. And I got some real housekeeping matters. So there are 3 people missing keys. One person missing a key set with Chevy, Mercedes, and a Vallejo. She or he has a lot of cars. But anyway, they need their keys. So if anybody has them, or if they can find them, that would be really helpful. So with that in mind, our panel is really one in which we're going to look at both the problem and the solution, and look at it really from some real policy objectives that can be accomplished that the Congress is considering now. We know we can't be political in this environment, but we will be talking about policies that are under consideration, as opposed to talking about in terms of the politics of this consideration. So I want to give you a couple of little pieces of background. When we look at net worth and wealth, white net worth is 13 times that of blacks. Education alone is not sufficient to close the gap. So one of the constant policy mantras is, but if we can get people to go to school. Studies have shown that black men with a college degree have higher unemployment rates than whites without a high school diploma. So college alone is not sufficient, necessary but not sufficient. Wealth lost in the housing sector exacerbated the racial wealth gap. There was an overuse of subprime, lower property values of homes in black areas, including black suburban areas. Generational impact of home ownership for whites and being able to pass down an asset that was not allowed to occur for blacks en masse until at least the late 1980s. We've got to look at this thing from a historical context, because so much of wealth is cumulative and about passing it on. And so we'll spend some time talking about the policies that allowed that to happen in certain communities, and how certain communities were systematically discriminated against. And then finally, we also will be looking at various efforts by governors to shrink the public sector employment and terminate defined benefit pensions, and what the impact that could have on black wealth creation. The public sector has been the one area in which there's been an increase or a steady source of employment for the black middle class. And when you see these kind of shifts, this will have a dramatic impact on the wealth creation in the community. And so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about these issues. We've got experts here who are going to talk about these issues. I'm going to give you a little introduction of them, and then I'm going to pose some questions to them, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Is that okay with everybody? Okay. So our first panelist will be Dr. John Powell. Dr. Powell is the Executive Director of the Haas Institute for the Fair and Inclusive Society. He's a professor of law and a professor of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies at the University of California at Berkeley, where he holds both the Robert D. Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion seat. Previously, Dr. Powell was the Executive Director of the Carr Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. Under his direction, the Haas Institute emerged as a national leader on scholarship related to race, racism, and opportunity. Today, he will focus, among other things, on the wealth gaps, both racial and class-based discrimination, and how these disparities impact the economy. Our second panelist will be Dr. Susan Gooden. Dr. Susan Gooden is a professor of public administration and policy at the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs and the executive director of the Grace Harris Leadership Institute at the Virginia Commonwealth University. She's a prolific author on social equity, welfare policy, and post-secondary education. She is a fellow at the National Academy of Public Administration and the president-elect of the American Society for the Public. Our next speaker will be Angela Glover-Backwell. Angela is the founder and chief executive officer of Policy Link, a national research institute aimed at advancing economic and social equity. Previously, Angela served as the senior vice president at the Rockefeller Foundation, where she oversaw the domestic and cultural divisions. And I will say, even though it wasn't on her bio, where she explored these issues well before they were popular and put together a framework for that kind of discussion 20 years ago, knowing that in anticipation of where we were headed and looking at the global transformation that was occurring. She's a lawyer by training. She gained national recognition as the founder of the Oakland Urban Strategies Council, where she pioneered new approaches to neighborhood revitalization. And our final speaker will be Jim Carr. Jim is a housing finance, banking, and urban policy consultant. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and was recently appointed the Coleman A. Young Endowed Chair and Professor of Urban Affairs at Wayne State University. Previously, Jim served as Chief Business Officer for the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, where he managed minority and women-owned business centers in major cities. Prior to this, Carr was Senior Vice President for Financial Innovation, Planning, and Research for the Fannie Mae Foundation and was the Assistant for Tax Policy and Federal Credit on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee. Jim will give us a wealth of information about the housing finance industry, what's going on there, what can go on there, and what our policies should be considered as they consider GSE reform. So I think we're going to have a very spirited balance of both the global position of the issue and the global picture of the issue and specific local and national initiatives that could be undertaken to close the wealth gap. And with that, we start with Dr. Powell.